Let's go, Alex. There is a moment in sports that does not make the highlight reel. You will not find it on Sports Center's top 10. It does not trend on Twitter because the algorithm has no appetite for nuance. The big accounts on Instagram do not clip it and share it with their millions of followers because it lacks a screaming announcer or a buzzer beater or a trophy lift. The mainstream press, if they mention it at all, file it away in two sentences, sometimes one, before moving on to the next story, the next scoreline, the next piece of business. But the people who were there, the ones who actually saw it with their own eyes, who felt the Roman sun on their necks and heard the sound of the ball coming off the strings, they carry it differently. They don't need to save the clip. They don't need to retweet it. It lives in them somewhere between the ribs and the spine, and it surfaces at odd moments, in traffic, at dinner, in the middle of a random Tuesday. That is the kind of memory we are talking about. May 7, 2025. Court 6 at the Foro Italico in Rome. Alex is on the far side of the net from Kostiuk, and the scoreboard reads a clean, brutal 6-0. One set gone, not a single game won. 0 by every conventional measure that professional tennis uses to separate the signal from the noise. This match is already a formality. The story has been written. The plot has been resolved. The only thing left is the paperwork. The crowd, if you were to consult the standard operating procedure for afternoons like this, should be thinning out. People should be quietly folding their programs, tucking them into bags, checking their phones for metro times. They should be heading for the exits in that polite, shuffling way that crowds have when they want to beat the queue and still feel like they stayed long enough to be respectful. Instead, something strange happens, something that does not show up in the box score. The noise gets louder. The murmur that had been building toward apathy suddenly tilts in the opposite direction. Philippine flags start rising above the stands, unfurling in the Roman breeze like declarations of war against indifference. People who had every socially acceptable reason to leave, the heat, the score, the long walk back to the hotel, are not just staying, they are singing. And if you watch the video closely, if you pull it up on a phone and squint at the pixels, you can see Alex look up at them. Not a glance, not a quick check of the clock. A real look, the kind where the neck turns and the eyes find a specific section of the crowd and the mouth does something that is not quite a smile and not quite a grimace. That moment. That specific exchange between a player who just got bageled, who just lost 6 games in a row in less time than it takes to watch a movie, and a crowd that refused to treat it like a funeral. That is where this story actually begins. Not with a trophy, not with a ranking milestone, not with a post-match interview that gets transcribed and filed away, with a crowd that decided the scoreboard was not telling the whole truth. Now it is May 2026. A full year has passed. Alex is ranked 44th in the world, which is not where she wants to be but is also not where she started. She has Tony Nadal, the man who engineered 10 Italian Open titles with his nephew Rafael, the architect of a dynasty, the person who turned clay court tennis into a form of tactical warfare, sitting in her coaching box. And she has just made a decision that tells you everything about where her head is right now in this specific moment, on the eve of the tournament that broke her open last spring. She was the third seed at the WTA 125 Catalonia Open in Spain. Let me repeat that, third seed, a comfortable draw, a favorable surface situation, or at least one that was less hostile than what awaits her in Rome. A tournament that she was positioned realistically to potentially win. The kind of event where rankings are built and confidence is restored and the press releases write themselves. She withdrew. Not because of injury, not because of fatigue, not because of some convenient ailment that allows everyone to save face. She withdrew because Rome called louder and she wanted to be on the Foro Italico courts a full week before the draw was even set, before her name was even placed in a box on a sheet of paper, before the announcers had to learn how to pronounce her last name correctly. She wanted to be there on that red clay with that Roman light breathing that air, while the tournament was still just a promise and not yet a pressure. Think about what that says. Think about the psychology of a player who took a 6-0, 6-1 loss on this exact playing field last year, on this exact court, in front of thousands of people who had paid money and taken time out of their lives to watch her compete. Her response to that memory was not to avoid it. Her response was to come back earlier and stay longer. That is not someone running from a bad memory. That is someone who decided, somewhere in the quiet hours between matches and flights and hotel rooms, that the bad memory is going to become the motivation. That the scar tissue is going to become the armor. Let us go back to 2025 for a second because the full picture of what Alex was dealing with matters here. Kostiuk did not just beat her in that first round, she walked through her. First set done in under 30 minutes, the kind of set that feels less like a competition and more like an exhibition of one player's skills and another player's helplessness. Second set barely more contested. Alex won 1 game total. 1 game on a court where Rafael Nadal had built what people genuinely call a cathedral of clay. The word is not hyperbole. Foro Italico is hallowed ground for anyone who loves this surface, and Alex walked away from it with exactly one game to show for her afternoon. And here is what she did after. She went to the net. She did not slink off with her head down. She did not rush through the handshake to get to the locker room before the tears came. She looked up at the crowd, the same crowd that had just watched her lose 12 of 13 games, the same crowd that had every right to be shuffling toward the exits. She acknowledged them properly, a real acknowledgement, the kind that takes time and intention. And then she came back out the same week in the doubles draw with Coco Gauff as her partner, and she fought all the way to the quarterfinals. After a personal demolition, a tennis execution, a performance that would have sent lesser players into a spiral of self-doubt, she chose to stay in the building and compete again. You can talk about mental strength all you want. You can write articles about it and record podcasts about it and build entire brands around the concept of resilience. But that is what it actually looks like when it is real. It is not a post-match speech. It is not a carefully worded Instagram caption. It is coming back the next day when you do not have to, when everyone would understand if you wanted to disappear, when the easiest thing in the world would be to pack your bags and fly to the next city and pretend Rome never happened. Fast forward to April 2026. Alex is in Linz, Austria. She wins her first clay match of the season 6-4, 6-3 over Julia Grabher, who is ranked 89th in the world. Clean win, controlled. The kind of performance where you can see a player executing a plan rather than just surviving a surface she hates. Her footwork is better. Her shot selection is smarter. There are moments in the rally where she looks like she belongs on the dirt, which was not always the case. But here is the detail from that match that stuck with me. The detail that I keep coming back to when I think about who Alex is as a person and not just as a player. When she walked up to the microphone for her on-court interview mid-sentence without warning, she switched into Tagalog. She looked directly into the crowd, not at the camera, not at the tournament director, not at the official holding the microphone, and she found the Filipino fans, in Austria, at a mid-level clay event where the Filipino contingent in the audience probably numbered in the dozens at most. She found them anyway. She spoke to them in the language that belongs only to them, the language of home, the language that connects her to a country she represents but does not always live in. Akin na yan. Dito, thank you to all the Filipinos who are here. That is not a PR move, that is a reflex. That is someone who carries her community with her into every room she walks into, regardless of how big or small that room is. It would have been easier to just speak English. It would have been faster. It would have been what almost every other player on tour would have done. But Alex does not take the easy route, she never has. Now here is the tension at the center of everything happening in Rome this May. I do not want to gloss over it because it is real, and pretending it does not exist would be a disservice to everyone who is paying attention. Alex, by her own honest admission, prefers hard courts. She said it herself in Rome last year, unprompted, without any attempt to soften the message. She was not making an excuse, she was not complaining. She was just being straight with people, the way she always is, and the way that sometimes gets her in trouble with people who prefer their athletes to be polished and evasive. And the 2026 clay numbers have not argued with her. Going into the Italian Open, her clay record sits at 2 wins and 3 losses. That is not a typo, 2 and 3. The 3 losses came against Leylah Fernandez, Elise Mertens, and Carolina Muchova. Read those names again. Elite clay specialists, every one of them. Players who grew up on this surface, who slide like figure skaters, who know every trick and trap that red clay has to offer. The first set scores in those matches were 1-6, 2-6, and 0-6. That last one you already know. That last one is the memory she carried with her from Rome. Tennis 365 ran a piece after her Madrid loss on April 25 that put a finer point on it. They noted that Alex had dropped 5 matches this year in which she won 5 or fewer games combined. 5 matches. 5 or fewer total games across 5 separate contests. That is not a bad run of form, that is not a slump. That is a pattern with a specific shape to it, a recurring structure that looks less like bad luck and more like a tactical vulnerability that the top players have learned to exploit. So that is the honest picture, a player who openly prefers a different surface, a clay record that reflects that preference without apology. A pattern of first set collapses against the best clay players in the draw. That is the problem, that is the mountain, that is the thing that keeps her up at night and drives her into the practice court at odd hours. Why is she here then? Why did she skip Spain, arrive a week early, and choose the hardest possible examination when she could have taken the easier path? Why would anyone voluntarily walk into the place that broke them, 1 year later, with the same surface under their feet and the same pressure on their shoulders? Because the easier path does not fix the pattern. The easier path does not teach you how to win on clay. The easier path is just a longer way to the same destination, and Alex is not interested in taking the scenic route. And because something changed in April 2026, something that the mainstream tennis coverage has almost completely underreported relative to how significant it actually is. Something that should have been on the front page of every tennis website and the lead story of every podcast, but somehow got lost in the shuffle of rankings updates and sponsorship announcements. Tony Nadal is now working with Alex's team, not as a consultant, not as a name attached to a press release to generate some off-season buzz, as an active part of her coaching setup. The man who stood in Rafael Nadal's corner for every single one of those 10 Roman titles. The person who designed the footwork, the spin, the relentless physical baseline game that made Rafa the most dominant clay court player in the history of the sport. He is now transferring that blueprint to a 20-year-old from Carson City who prefers hard courts and has a pattern of first-set collapses on the dirt. Alex's own words when she was asked about it tell you exactly how much this means to her. She said, "If you had told me this years ago, I would have completely lost my mind. I wouldn't have believed you." She watched Rafa win at Roland Garros when she was 12 years old. She was in the stands as a kid, eating something overpriced from a concession stand, squinting at the court, watching him do something that seemed almost mythological on clay. And now the architect of that mythology is sitting in her box, watching her footwork, correcting her positioning, transferring 20-plus years of clay knowledge into her game in real time. Greg Rusedski said something about this on his podcast in the week leading up to Rome that I think deserves more attention than it got. Rusedski reached a career high of number 4 in the world. He played in the 1997 U.S. Open final. He is not someone who throws out assessments casually, not someone who reaches for hyperbole to fill airtime. When he talks, people who know tennis listen. His diagnosis on what Tony Nadal's presence means for Alex was specific in a way that television analysts rarely are. He said that being at the academy with Rafa on clay, spending that kind of time with her, means people are going to find it a lot harder to hit through her on this surface, that it is going to be more physically combated. That the vulnerabilities that clay specialists have been exploiting, the ones that led to those 1-6 and 2-6 and 0-6 first sets, are not going to be as accessible anymore. That the blueprint is being rewritten while the season is still in progress. And then Rusedski said something that stopped the tennis conversation entirely. He said she is like Manny Pacquiao. Anywhere in the world where there are people from the Philippines, they are always talking about her. Her matches sell out automatically. She opens up a marketplace. When a man who played in a Grand Slam final reaches for the name of Manny Pacquiao to explain what Alex means to people, he is not making a tennis comparison. He is recognizing something that goes way beyond rankings and results, way beyond forehands and backhands, way beyond the usual metrics that sports journalists rely on. Pacquiao did not just win fights. He gave millions of people a reason to feel seen in spaces that were not built for them. He walked into arenas where people like him were not supposed to be headliners, and he left with belts and respect and a permanent place in the culture. Rusedski is placing Alex in that same conversation with the Foro Italico as the stage. Now let us talk about Rome itself, because this part of the story does not get nearly enough space in the regular coverage. The commentators mention it sometimes, usually in passing, usually as a colorful detail before getting back to the tennis. But it is not a colorful detail, it is the whole background of the painting. There are approximately 38,000 permanent Filipino residents living in Rome right now. Not tourists, not people who flew in for the tournament, grabbed some photos and flew home. People who have built their lives in this city, who work here, raise families here, pay taxes here, navigate daily existence in a country that did not construct its national identity around them. They are nurses and caregivers and service workers and students and professionals. They are the infrastructure of the city in ways that most Romans never see. Alex said it herself when she arrived last year. She said she did not expect such a big Filipino population in Rome. She said she had run into Filipinos 5 times just walking the streets before she had even played a match. At a cafe, on a corner, in a shop, just walking around being a person in a city, and there they were. Across all of Italy, over 156,000 documented Filipino residents call the country home. The Lazio region, which is Rome, holds more than a quarter of them. Put yourself in that position for a moment. Imagine what it feels like to be part of a community that is largely invisible in the public life of the place you live. You work hard, you contribute, you pay your bills and raise your children and do all the things that citizens do, but you are not quite of the place. You are always a visitor, always a guest, always someone who is tolerated rather than celebrated. And then one afternoon you take the metro to the Foro Italico, And there's a 20-year-old from the Philippines on court 6 playing a WTA 1000 draw that broadcasts to 190 countries. Not as a wild card, not as a feel-good story that the local paper runs on page 12. As a ranked professional who belongs there, who earned her spot, who has the ranking and the results in the game to stand on the same court as the best players in the world. That is not just an athletic achievement, that is a visibility event. That is a community that has been largely unseen in Italian public life suddenly appearing on one of the most glamorous tennis stages in Europe. The Foro Italico is not some backwater facility. It is hallowed ground. It is where legends are made and history is written. And for a few hours in May, the flags of the Philippines flew there. When the score went to 6-0 in that first set last May, those 38,000 people and every Filipino watching around the world had a choice. Accept the conventional response. File it away as a first-round exit, a learning experience, a building block for next year. Wait for the next tournament, the next chance, the next opportunity to feel that pride again. Or decide that the score does not define the story. Decide that the number on the board is not the number that matters. Decide that their investment in Alex does not run on results alone. They chose the second one. The flags went up. The singing started. The video spread across every Filipino social media feed within hours, not as a celebration of victory but as something more durable than victory. As a declaration that their support was not conditional on winning. As a statement that they would be there whether the score was 6-0 or 6-0 in the other direction. That kind of loyalty is rare in sports. That kind of loyalty is the kind that players remember when they are old and retired and looking back on their careers. And that decision, that collective refusal to let a 6-0 scoreline define the narrative, turns out to have been correct. Not just emotionally correct, but prophetically correct. Because look at the trajectory from that moment forward. She finishes 2025 with a year-end ranking of 50th, a career high at the time. She reaches 29th in March 2026, the highest any Filipino woman has ever been ranked in WTA history. She beats Iga Swiatek. She reaches a WTA 1000 semifinal. She gives a post-match interview at Madrid 2026 in Spanish, fluent and warm and totally at ease, switching between languages like someone who has been doing it her whole life. And the clip goes everywhere because people are watching someone who can command a room in 3 languages and make it look effortless. The fans who stayed on court 6 for a 6-0 loss were not being delusional. They were not being sentimental. They were not wearing rose-colored glasses. They were early. They saw something the scoreboard had not caught up to yet. They saw a player who was going to learn from that loss, who was going to use it as fuel, who was going to come back the next day and play doubles, and then come back the next year and do something that no one expected. And now she is back. She is already on the Foro Italico practice courts. She pulled out of a seated spot in Spain to be here first. Tony Nadal is watching her hit. Tony Nadal is walking the sidelines, watching her footwork, correcting her positioning, transferring that 20-plus years of clay knowledge into her game in real time. Roland Garros is 3 weeks away. The clay swing is reaching its crescendo. The Italian Open field includes Aryna Sabalenka, Coco Gauff, Iga Swiatek, and Alina Rybakina. Read those names again. That is not a forgiving draw. That is not a gentle reintroduction to a surface that has caused her problems. That is the deep end of the pool, and Alex is jumping in on purpose. A run to the quarterfinals, 3 wins against that caliber of opposition on clay would push Alex back toward the top 35. It would reapproach her career-high ranking, and it would do it with clay credibility attached, the one thing missing from her resume. It would tell the tennis world, and more importantly tell the Roland Garros draw committee, that what Tony Nadal has been building with her is real and it is ready, that the pattern has been broken, that the first set collapses are a thing of the past. But I want to come back to something before we get to predictions and projections and all the other things that sports commentators like to do. I want to come back to something that I think matters more than any of that. Alex has never once framed her clay difficulties as a ceiling. Not once. In every interview, every press conference, every casual conversation she has had with reporters who ask the same question in slightly different ways, the language has been consistent. Time and work. She said she believes she can play as well on clay. Not that she hopes to, not that she's going to try, that she believes she can. There's a difference between hopping and believing, and Alex crossed that line a long time ago. At the start of 2026, she posted a vision board that included the clay swing specifically. Roland Garros was on there, not as a dream, not as a distant goal, as a destination. This was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. This was always the plan. The plan was to get better on clay. The plan was to learn from the losses. The plan was to bring in Tony Nadal and do the work and see what happened. She turns 21 this month in Rome. She turns 21 after skipping a tournament she was seeded 3rd at in order to spend more time on the courts where her idol used to make history. That is the kind of decision that tells you who someone is. That is the kind of decision that separates the players who want to be great from the players who know that greatness requires sacrifice. And here is the thing about the Foro Italico that I think people underestimate when they talk about Alex's motivation here. This is not just a WTA 1000 event. This is not just another stop on the calendar, another city, another hotel, another press conference. This is the specific place where, as a 12-year-old girl, she watched Rafael Nadal do something that seemed impossible. She was in the crowd here as a kid, eating something overpriced, squinting at the court, watching him hit those forehands that defied physics. And the man who coached that kid she was watching is now coaching her. Close that loop for a second. The girl in the stands watching Rafa win his cathedral becomes the woman on the court with Rafa's coach in her corner. If you wrote that as a script, someone would tell you it was too neat, too convenient, too much like the movies. But that is the actual situation. That is what is happening on the red clay at the Foro Italico right now in real time, while the rest of the tennis world is focused on other stories, other players, other narratives. So here is where we land. The Italian Open draw drops May 5th. The moment Alex's first-round opponent is confirmed, this channel is going to be the first place breaking down that matchup, what it means tactically, what it tells us about her current form, and what it suggests about her role in Garros seeding. Over the next 2 weeks in Rome, every match she plays is a data point in the most consequential question of her 2026 season. Has Tony Nadal's clay education taken root? Can she translate practice court progress into match wins against players who have spent their entire careers on this surface? Can she break the pattern that Tennis 365 identified? Can she stop losing those first sets 1-6 and 2-6 and 0-6? Can she become the player she believes she can be? 3 wins, that is the number. 3 wins at a WTA 1000 on clay against that field Sabalenka, Goff, Swiatek, Rybakina would change the conversation about Alex heading into the French Open. 3 wins would announce that the project is working. 3 wins would silence the doubters and validate the believers and send a message to every other player on tour: she is coming for the clay. And for the 38,000 Filipinos who live in this city and will not need to book a single flight to watch it happen, for the 156,000 across Italy who have been waiting for exactly this moment, the stakes have never been about ranking points. The stakes have never been about prize money or sponsorship deals or any of the usual metrics that measure success in professional sports. The stakes have been about what it feels like to watch someone carry you into rooms you were never supposed to be in. Court 6, May 7, 2025. Score reads 6-0. Flags going up anyway. That was not denial. That was not wishful thinking. That was a community reading a story that the scoreboard had not written yet. That was a crowd that understood something before the experts did. That was faith in the truest sense of the word, not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act in spite of it. The next chapter starts this week, on the same courts in the same city, with the same flags in the stands and the same hope in the air. And if you are not here when it happens, if you are not watching, not paying attention, not following along as Alex takes the court at the Foro Italico for the first time since that 6-0 afternoon, you will be reading about it somewhere else the morning after. And the morning after, it will already be too late. The moment will have passed. The story will have been written. But the people who are there, the ones who actually see it, they will carry it differently. They always do.